Okay, so what are some of the fossils that you can find in Missouri? So first one is going to be cyanobacteria, and then in terms of biology, it's in the kingdom Monera. So it's going to be a bacteria, meaning that you would not be able to see it with the naked eye, but you could see it with a microscope, and it is cyano bacteria, meaning that it can photosynthesize and it would produce oxygen. And when we did our lesson on fossils, we said that what would happen is that this microscopic bacteria would cover the top of a rock, okay, and then it would be exposed to sunlight, and then it was very close to the shoreline, so that during high tide it would be underwater and low tide it would be exposed. And when these organisms would die, then new bacteria would start to grow on top of them. And then when they would die, new bacteria would start to grow on top of them, and so it's going to make these mound-like structures. And so you can find some of these mound-like structures if you go down Highway 65 from Springfield and you're on your way down to Branson. You're going to find some places where the highway cuts right through limestone. And then if you go up onto some of those rocks up there, you're going to find these circular samples of rock, and what that is it's those mound-like structures formed by this kind of bacteria. So this was very important because this bacteria produced oxygen, which began to modify the atmosphere of the Earth. Okay, the next one, so now we're into the kingdom of animals, and this is going to be the phylum of Cnidaria, and it is going to be coral. And so there's fossilized coral on the left, and then modern day coral on the right. Okay, another kind of animal is from the phylum Bryozoa, and these are animals, but you would, if you looked at it, you would think that it's kind of like a flower, but it's not. So this is an animal. It would be a filter feeder that would filter very, very small particles out of the water. And so there you can see pictures of the fossil and then pictures of what it looked like possibly when it was alive. Okay, another kind of animal is from the phylum Brachiopoda. And now I've got next to it in the word clams, but they're not clams. But you, in your head, you have an image of what a clam looks like. And so these would be shelled organisms, and they would get their calcium carbonate out of the water in order to make their shells. Okay, here is yet another phylum from animals, and so this is the phylum Mollusca, and so this is, now it's not quite an octopus, but you're all pretty much familiar with what an octopus looks like, and so it's got these tentacles. Well, these things would have tentacles that would have come out of that shell. These organisms would have gotten very big. So that shell there is probably about the size of your fist, but there are some samples of shells that are 6 feet in diameter. And then it would have had an octopus that would have come out of it that might have had tentacles maybe 20 feet long. So they were huge early in Earth history. Okay, another one is phylum Arthropoda. So this is the phylum that insects are in. And so one of the most common kinds of arthropoda that you find here in Missouri is the trilobites. And so you tend to find these in the northern eastern part of the state. And so it's kind of like a roly-poly. These things could probably curl up into a ball if necessary, and they would have had 20 legs that would come out the side, and they could either crawl on the ocean floor, or some of them could actually swim. And so this was a very common kind of organism that lived in the oceans roughly 500 million years ago, and it was highly successful. So one of the most successful organisms that ever existed. So they were around for hundreds of millions of years before they went extinct. Okay, here is another one that you should be very familiar with if you live here in southwestern Missouri, and that is crinoids. And so these are still animals. They look like a flower, and so they would have a head, and then tentacles would come out of the head, and it was a filter feeder, so it could grab pieces of food out of the water and then bring it to its head where it would digest it. Now these things would had a stalk, so like a flower, and they were attached to the seafloor. Now the problem though is they lived very close to the shoreline, and so we know that shorelines can be very active places with wave action. So as soon as these things would die, they tended to be broken apart by the wave action, so that all you find today is just jumbles of little discs. But if you take the discs and you stack them on top of each other, that's where you get the stalk from. And then if you find even smaller discs, those are pieces that came from the tentacles. Now occasionally you might find a crinoid that is completely intact. So what had to have happened is the crinoid died, it fell over, and immediately was covered over by mud and was protected from the wave action. Now if you find one of those crinoids, you might want to sell it on eBay because they're very valuable, complete crinoid fossils. Okay, here's another kind of animal. So these are called graptolites, and those things right there are maybe about this long, so they're pretty small. They are they're macroscopic, but you just barely see them with the naked eye. So they were a kind of an animal that they were colonial, so they tended to live together in large colonies. Okay, here's something that you should recognize is from the phylum Chordata, and so these are meaning that these things are going to have backbones. And so an example of this is you might find a fossilized fish, and then in a lot of in the St. Louis region, there was a kind of a swampish area where there were some ice age mammals that got stuck in the swamp, and then they died, and then they got covered up. And then today we've found their bones, we put them back together. So there is a museum just south of St. Louis that has a whole bunch of these ice age mammals reconstructed. Another place where you find ice age mammals is in caves, because sometimes what would happen is an animal would die, would fall into a sinkhole, and then would get into a cave system, and then the bones might wash into the cave and collect there. Another possibility is that the animal might have been killed by a predator, and then the predator pulled the animal into the cave and just left its bones in there. So caves are a good place to find ice age bones. Okay, there are also plants that you can find in Missouri. So here is horsetails. Now today horsetails have a stalk that's about this big. Okay, but back then, so early in the Cambrian Ordovician time period, ferns could have been as big as trees. So they would have had a trunk that could have been this big. So they were gigantic. You can also find the imprints of the leaves in coal uh, areas. Okay, let's take a break. When we come back, we will talk about the geological history of Missouri.